Hey y'all, this is Brown at I have Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Darkhawk Return to Forever. This storyline took place in issues 21 through 25 of the Darkhawk series, and I have some fond memories of this particular storyline. Mainly because when I first read it, I was in junior high at the time, not when the actual issues came out, but this was like in the late 90s, a few years after the series had ended actually. But I first got a hold of the Darkhawk comics, when I was around junior high age, and around that time I was kind of going through some tough times, and comic books in general, um, and especially this particular storyline helped to get me through those tough times. But for the purpose of doing this review, when I reread these issues, I appreciate the fact that the creative team actually gave us an origins of Darkhawk. And sometimes what would happen with the comic book series, especially in the 90s, is if a 25th issue is coming out, there's usually some sort of special event going on. And in the case of, say, for instance, a comic book like Ghost Rider, it was a rather memorable showdown with an old enemy of his, namely Blackout, the vampire. And an issue of Sleepwalker, well, there was an alien invasion in which Sleepwalker himself took part in, and which really put into question, was he really a good guy or not? And so in the 25th issue of Darkhawk, we actually get a payoff to the mystery that's been teased, over several issues, and we get a genuine origin story, and I really appreciated that. And it's an origin story that stuck for several years, but it wasn't until a storyline called War of Kings, which I believe was predominantly X-Men related, but there was a 2-issue miniseries for Darkhawk that tied into that storyline. And it was a really well done miniseries. The writing was good and the artwork was exquisite. But the one downside is that they retcon the origin story that's given in this particular story arc of Return to Forever, and the way they do it, it calls into question just how much of the stories we read in the original Darkhawk series actually happened, or did they happen the way we think they happened? And that's the one downside to that retcon, which was an otherwise good story. But for the sake of this review, we're going to focus on the origin story we got in Return to Forever in the original series. So starting off, we're coming off of the tail end of a bunch of upheaval in Darkhawk's, or I should say Chris Powell's personal life. And he's trying to, balance his, time between, being Chris Powell and, being with his family and, trying to have a social life in high school while trying to process the grief he's going through and having lost his father. And then on the other hand, he's trying to do his duties as Darkhawk, fighting crime and what have you. But he starts to get these telepathic assaults that he can't explain, and it's only when he's in his Darkhawk form and he's trying to figure out, okay, is this Sauron or Cywolf, who were two villains they had gone up against recently. But whenever he turns back into Chris Powell, the pain stops. And so he's trying to figure out, okay, just add this to the list of things to worry about, that kind of thing. And so one day he's with his family and they're at Mike Powell's grave, which unfortunately it's an empty grave, because his body had washed out to sea. And then he asks his family if they wouldn't mind, just going on without him, so he can, have some time alone with his father. And so, his mom and his brothers, they're bummed that he doesn't want to go home with them just yet, but they decide to give him a space. And so, while he's, reflecting on his life and, hoping that his, father, would have approved of how he'd handled things and just, thinking about his father in general, he's interrupted by Allegra Bazin, the daughter of the late Felipe Bazin, who was also washed out to sea and also has an empty coffin. And and it's really fascinating because Allegra, being the being the daughter of a crime lord, you'd think would have a lot of bad blood with Chris Powell, because she definitely didn't have any love lost for Mike Powell, but at the same time, she had actually done certain actions which had actually helped Chris Powell, as well as his family, and these actions also helped Darkhawk as well. And so, Chris doesn't quite know, where she stands on things, but the two of them, they kind of, connect, as they walk through the cemetery together, because, both their fathers, are buried in the same cemetery, and, both of their fathers killed each other. But, they find that there's a certain amount of commonality that they have, and, they're, forming what could be a spark, some chemistry, but then they're interrupted when a drive-by shooting, hits them, and Chris is able to get Allegra out of the way, but before they can see who was shot at them, they drove off. And so Allegra's bodyguards come along, thinking that Chris is the one who attacked her, but she's having to say, no, this guy saved my life, unlike you guys. And so she offers to give Chris, a ride back to his family, but, he says, no, I'm good. And so she tells him to be careful and, watch his head out there. And she goes on her way. And so Chris, he's trying to process all this because, here he is, getting cozy with the daughter of one of his enemies, and of course, she doesn't know that he's really Darkhawk, and so he's like, okay, how's she going to react to that if she finds out, that kind of thing. But then he gets home and he finds out that, his family has a visitor in his girlfriend Cheryl. And so, at first, Chris is kind of like, oh, great, I get to see you, and and because, the two of them have kind of had an on again, off again thing due to a lot of the, drama in his personal life, as well as, him being Darkhawk and what have you. But just as, they're about to, sit down, relax and what have you, he makes the mistake of calling Cheryl Allegra, which makes her really mad, and she storms off. And so, now that Chris has, a whole evening to himself, he's like, well, may as well, try and figure out what the hell that was going on in the cemetery back there. And so he rides on over there, with his bike, and he gets there at night, and he notices, something, because he's trying to figure out, okay, one, who shot at him and Cheryl, and two, were they going after, who shot at him and Allegra, and were they trying to kill Allegra, or were they trying to kill him? Like, does someone know that he's Darkhawk? And so, he gets into the cemetery to see if he can find some clues, but right where Felipe's empty casket is, he sees that there's some people over there, and there's these two guys, trying to dig it up, and he kind of, hides off in the bushes, trying to figure out if he can see what's going on. And it turns out that these two guys that are working to get Bazin's casket open or out of the ground, the guy who's orchestrating all this, turns out, is the one who shot at Chris and Allegra. And this guy had actually worked for Bazin as his expert on the occult, and it's because that Bazin had an interest in the occult is why that he was initially trying to get a hold of Darkhawk's amulet in the first place. And so when he died, a lot of the paranormal artifacts that he had collected over the years went into his coffin. And so not everyone knew about that, but this guy did. And so he's hoping to, find some, go through the artifacts and see what power he can get a hold of. But once they get Bazin's coffin out of the ground, he decides that he doesn't want to, share anything with the guy who did the majority of the digging. And so he's about to, blow his brains out. And, Chris, seeing this, I mean, he can't just stand by and let the guy get killed. And so he turns back into Darkhawk, knowing that he's probably going to be assaulted by whatever this telepathic attack is that he's been experiencing. And so, unfortunately, though, he's unable to prevent the guy from grabbing one of the artifacts and using it to transform himself into this sort of weird flesh-colored three-headed monster, which is kind of what you see on the cover here. And said monster, goes ahead and takes a bite off of the guy who he was going to kill in the first place, and literally just chomps his head off. And so, Chris, as Darkhawk, takes a fight to this guy, but each of these heads has a different power, and it is a little more than Darkhawk can handle himself. And second of all, he starts getting those telepathic assaults again, and so once he's incapacitated, the monster is about to grab a hold of him and more or less rip him in half, bite him, eat him, wherever you want to say. But right at that moment, though, Ghost Rider, aka Danny Ketch, makes his presence known, because as it turns out, this cemetery is kind of near Ghost Rider's stomping grounds. And so once this innocent blood has been spilled by way of the guy who did the majority of digging up Basim's grave, well, basically, I mean, once that guy's blood's been spilled by having his head bitten off, Ghost Rider was more or less summoned by the innocent blood being spilled. And so he charges in on his mechanized hellish motorcycle, which is a really badass piece of equipment, by the way. And here, real quick, there we are. And so he charges in on the motorcycle, crashing through the gates like something off of a heavy metal album cover, and takes the fight to the monster. And so Darkhawk is able to switch back into Chris, but he's trying to figure out, okay, what's his strategy here? Because he sees Ghost Rider putting up a good fight against the monster, but the monster's seemingly outclassing Ghost Rider and thrashing him around. And so Chris turns back into Darkhawk to try and help Ghost Rider out, and they're able to sort of turn the tables on the monster, working together, and they're able to drive the monster off. But before they can pursue him, Chris is hit with that telepathic assault again, and Ghost Rider, is trying to see if he can help him. But Darkhawk's telling him, no, you can't do anything for me. Go after the monster. We can't let him get away. And so Ghost Rider, agrees to do so. But he's telling Darkhawk that he he doesn't know what demons he's wrestling with, but he knows that he has a strength that he doesn't comprehend yet, and that he'll be able to triumph over his own inner demons, just as he himself has. As in, Ghost Rider's literally wrestled with his own demons, so to speak. And so, Ghost Rider goes off to go after the monster, and Darkhawk turns back into Chris, as he's been hiding, from Ghost Rider's line of sight. And so, going forward, he goes back home, and a little while later, ends up going to his job at the radio station, and he hears that there's a fight going on between Ghost Rider and this monster at a public mall where there's a lot of innocent civilians. And so Chris, he's trying to find his amulet, because he put it away, because he originally had it around his neck, but because of the telepathic assaults, he didn't know if that was going to affect him if he had it on his person. So he stashed it in one of the drawers in his desk, or the desk that he uses to work with. And but unfortunately, one of the DJs kind of swiped it, just as a prank. And they're on the air, and they're taunting Chris about it, basically thinking that Chris isn't going to just waltz in and snatch it right back from him, since, well, they're live on the air. And Chris, I mean, he's like, well, it's a toss up between my career and me taking responsibility and trying to help Ghost Rider defeat this monster that, you know, I feel partially to blame for. And so Chris charges into the booth and swipes his amulet back. And as he's running out of there, you know, everyone's telling him that you're fired and all this stuff. And he's like, you know, tell me something I don't know. And so he goes to the rooftop where they have a helicopter that's about to take off, and you know, for the radio station. And once the helicopter is in the air, Chris turns into Darkhawk and uses his grappling hook to hitch a ride on a helicopter to the mall, which is where the helicopter's headed. And so once they get to the mall, you know, Chris sees that, you know, Ghost Rider's probably in need of some form of assistance, because, you know, he's not able to defeat the monster, and the monster, you know, just keeps knocking him around, but Ghost Rider just keeps on getting back up. But at the same time, there's definitely a danger to some of the civilians. And so, you know, Chris, you know, he's having to sort of strategically time his transformations, you know, like, okay, you know, he can't stay as Darkhawk for forever because, you know, of the telepathic assaults. He still doesn't know what's going on with those, but he's able to maintain long enough to where he and Ghost Rider are able to both take the monster out, and they wound the monster in such a way to where Darkhawk's able to use his grappling hook to, you know, pull the artifact out of the monster that started all this in the first place. And so once he does that, the monster turns back into the human that he was originally. And so you know, Ghost Rider, you know, basically thanks Darkhawk for his help and says that, you know, now that, you know, the guilty parties have been punished, you know, he's going to go on his way. And Darkhawk turns around to, you know, grab the artifact, but while he was talking to Ghost Rider, someone had come along and stolen it. And that's, you know, something that comes up to haunt Chris later on in this series. But while all this was going on, those telepathic assaults had also been hitting St. Johnny as well as the predecessor, the two derelicts that have been a part of the series for a bit now. And there's a voice basically, you know, telling them that this is what you get for helping Powell for, you know, against me. And so, you know, we don't know who this voice is yet, but basically it gets too much to where, you know, St. Johnny, he's like, okay, I have to find Chris. I have to find Powell. I can't take this anymore. And so the predecessor is trying to tell him, no, we can't betray him. You know, we can't turn him over to. And so, you know, St. Johnny, his hand turns into this sort of bio-organic gun, and he zaps the predecessor, you know, to where he's incapacitated. And it's similar to the type of gun that, you know, his hand turned into when he saved Darkhawk from Tombstone a while back. And so he goes to Chris Powell's house, and right when Chris gets there, you know, he sees St. Johnny, you know, basically threatening his brothers, you know, saying, you know, I need to find Chris, you know, tell me where he is or else, you know, blah, 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 blah. And so Chris, you know, he comes up, grabs St. Johnny, pulls him away from the house, and once the two of them are away, and basically, you know, at this, you know, construction site, you know, the two of them are talking, and Chris is, you know, demanding to know, you know, why, you know, St. Johnny was threatening his brothers, and he also wants to know, you know, what's going on with this telepathic assault, if he has anything to do with it. And because he's like, I know you know something about you know, who and what Darkhawk is. And so St. Johnny, though, zaps Chris and then turns into this weird, you know, bioorganic tank creature. It looks like something out of a Transformers cartoon. And he's, you know, basically telling, you know, Chris to prepare for something called mind death. And so Chris doesn't like the sound of that. And so he turns back into Darkhawk, and, you know, and he's having to, you know, try and survive against this, you know, creature that was once, you know, his friend, St. Johnny. But because of the telepathic assaults, I mean, you know, he's getting his ass kicked by this monster. And plus, the monster turns out to be rather powerful with all these, you know, weapons on him and what have you. And Code Blue, which is a police unit, that's sent in whenever there's like a super powered villain on the scene. They come up and try and help Darkhawk out, and they're able to distract St. Johnny enough to where Chris is able to turn back into Darkhawk, and he grabs this girder and shoves it through where he thinks St. Johnny's heart's gonna be, and basically doesn't hold back at all. And it does the trick, and St. Johnny, as he's as he's falling unconscious, he apologizes to Chris, but tells him that he's helpless to prevent he can't stop what's coming. And so shortly after that, Chris, or as Darkhawk is getting hit with another telepathic assault, but this time there's a voice and a face that looks similar to Darkhawk but different, and basically saying, I'm coming for you, something along those lines. And throughout the first three issues, we've gotten a glimpse of someone in a spaceship of some sort, and we've assumed that this spaceship's going through outer space, but instead it suddenly just erupts from the amulet on Darkhawk's chest and comes into our reality, and from that ship there emerges this being who looks like Darkhawk but a lot bigger and more ominous looking, and here he's right here, and he calls himself Evil Hawk, which is basically something that the human tongue could get itself around. And he has this staff that has a lot of power on there, along with his body's own power, and he starts trying to blast Darkhawk, and basically demanding that he turns back into Chris, so that way what they can commence with his mind death. And so the two of them battle each other, and Chris is trying to figure out what the hell's going on, while trying to survive this guy, while also trying to basically will himself through these telepathic assaults that this guy is hitting him with. And the fight is mostly in this Evil Hawk's favor, but then what ends up happening is Code Blue shows up again, and they try to help out Darkhawk against Evil Hawk, but Evil Hawk basically just gets tired of them and blasts them away, hurting quite a few of them. And so he incapacitates Darkhawk and takes him on board his ship. And as they go into space, he has Darkhawk, sort of attached to some harness, some sort of device to keep him in place. And he starts talking about how Chris is his one hope of escaping this basic living death sentence that he's had, because he's been in this body for a long time now, and he's starting to go crazy. And so Chris in the Darkhawk body, he doesn't know what this Evil Hawk dude's talking about, but he realizes that he has a chance to get out of the containment. And so he's able to turn back into Chris, so that way the security devices won't, they might loosen up a bit, kind of like they did in a similar situation several issues back. But then almost instantly he turns back into Darkhawk again, and once Evil Hawk sets his sights on him, the fight gets destructive to a point where the ship gets damaged, and at this point Chris is able to blast his way out of the ship, and it turns out that they're still hovering over the part of Earth where New York is. And so the two of them, they go flying out of the ship, or Darkhawk goes gliding out of the ship, and Evil Hawk actually flies after him. And so they land on the roof of the World Trade Center, and this was obviously pre 9/11, and once again, the fight continues, and Darkhawk is actually able to get the drop on Evil Hawk to a point where he briefly knocks him out. But right when he's trying to figure out, okay, how do I, contain the guy? Because what he did was, when Evil Hawk, had him in his grasp, Darkhawk removed his helmet, and his face, which we have never seen. Basically it freaks anyone out who sees it, right? And so Evil Hawk, once he sees Darkhawk's face, starts freaking out, and that gave him the chance to, basically, blast Evil Hawk at close range, to a point where it's like he got damaged, but Evil Hawk got the brunt of it, and it was enough to knock him out. And so, right when he's trying to figure out, okay, what do I do with this guy? Evil Hawk comes to, and in a rage, he blasts Darkhawk to pieces, to a point where it's like this, gooey pile of green blood / slime and pieces of Darkhawk's body all over the place of the rooftop. And and suddenly he starts freaking out. He's like, what have I done? I've ruined my one chance of salvation. And so the only thing that's really left is that's intact is Darkhawk's amulet. I mean, covered in gore though, but it's still intact. And so Evil Hawk, he picks it up, and at first, I mean, he's just distraught, and he's frustrated with himself, for having acted rashly. But then he picks up a spark of life, or I should say a spark of thought coming from the amulet, and he realizes that Chris is still alive, and he knows where he is. And Chris comes to, and he finds himself in a spaceship, a different one, not the one that Evil Hawk came in, but he finds himself in this weird contraption, where he's being held in place, and he's looking around, and he sees these other contraptions with configurations, that basically are clearly meant to hold people, or something. And he sees one other being in these contraptions. They're all empty except for his and this alien who seems to be lifeless. And so Chris, since he's awake, he's able to basically will himself through the energy that's keeping him in place. And once he is on the ground, he starts being attacked by these sort of security orbs. And as he's about to get blasted, suddenly they stop, and his voice starts talking to him, and basically it's telling him that it is the ship itself, and he's like, and you're in a place called null space, which is basically a different dimension altogether. And so Chris, I mean, he's looking out in a viewport, and he's seeing that he's not in Kansas anymore. And so he gets another telepathic attack from Evil Hawk, and Evil Hawk's telling him, I know where you are, and I'm coming for you. And so Chris, he's like, okay, and he's talking to the ship at this point, but he's like, hey, can you tell me what the hell's been going on here? I mean, if I'm going to get killed anyway, I mean, can you at least tell me how this all started? And so the voice, the ship, it tells him that it all started with this alien crime lord named Darkhawk, who was trying to find the ultimate expendable agent, because the agents he had, kept on getting killed on the line of duty, because of the nature of the criminal empire, I guess. And so he's trying to find a way to create an expendable agent who will nonetheless basically be able to survive in hostile environments indefinitely. And so to do this, he's kind of kept his ears to the ground in regards to technological discoveries in regards to science. And so what he decides to do is basically enlist these scientific inventors in his cause, sometimes forcibly and sometimes they come willingly, but he has them work together in such a way to where these discoveries are basically forged into a series of mechanical android bodies, and that are connected with these amulets, which in turn allow the owner of the amulet to switch places with this android. And each android has a different power ability and what have you. And so, and they've succeeded. But these scientists, though, in the time that they've been working with Darkhawk, they come to realize, the full extent of his evil plans, for his galactic criminal empire, and what these mechanical android bodies would basically make him further capable of. And so they decide to rebel against him. And so they themselves each take an amulet and switch places with the with the android bodies. And so Darkhawk, on one hand he's impressed that this experiment actually works, but on the other hand, though, he's annoyed because of the mutiny, and he was expecting the mutiny, but it came a lot sooner than expected. And so his security forces are putting up a good fight against these androids, but they are way more powerful than Bach expected. He knew of their power abilities, but this is the first time that he's seen them in combat, and they're going against him and his guys, and they're actually beating him. And so Bach decides to turn the tables, and he does so by waiting until one of the androids is so damaged that the wearer has to switch back to her organic form. And once she does so, Bach comes in and blows her brains out and takes her amulet for himself. And that's when he transforms into what would eventually be known as the Evil Hawk. And so at that point, he starts going after the other androids. And the thing is, he has the most powerful body. The owner of the amulet he killed had access to the most powerful android body. And so, he's more powerful than the androids that are still standing. But unfortunately, though, while he's more powerful, they have more skill and knowledge in terms of how to use their abilities, because they're being operated by their creators who know how to use the powers and what have you. Whereas, Bach is just a guy who killed the owner of one of the amulets and stole it for himself. And so, he basically, gets caught off guard by how powerful his own weaponry is, and he inadvertently damages his own ship. And so as the ship starts, basically going haywire, he decides to cut his losses and hightail it out of there. And unfortunately for him, his organic body, was destroyed in the blast, along with the bodies of everyone else who was linked with one of the androids. And so he hightails it out of there in his escape ship. And a couple of the other people are, the only ones left are two of them. Like, there are only two androids left. And but in regards to the ship itself, one of the other androids, prior to two of them being left, switched back to his organic form. and to that of an alien scientist named Aksh, who was one of the few people who joined Bach willingly out of scientific curiosity. And he changed back into his organic form so that way he could have his android body repaired, and which is an almost instantaneous process with the technology they have on the ship. But unfortunately, since the ship was going haywire, Aksh, right when he transformed back into his organic body, got caught in a blast, and his body just got obliterated. And so somehow, though, his consciousness, found itself merged with the ship, and for a time, he was almost driven insane by the process. But then, once he kind of, was able to, calm down and come to terms with his newfound existence, he was able to use the ship's repair services or technology and what have you to fix what damage he could. And he figured that, if he's going to be stuck like this, and since he played a part in creating these androids, then the least he could do is, serve as a, safe spot for them, for whoever has, one of these android bodies, so that way he can repair them, and they'll have a place to recover and what have you. Because as far as he knows, I mean, some of them are still alive. And so, but at that point, though, since, Aksh, who's the one who's talking to Chris, through the ship, he tells, Chris what he knows, but he's unable to answer, any of Chris's questions about, like why was his amulet in a carnival fairground, that kind of thing. Or, who were St. Johnny and who's the predecessor, and why is he called Darkhawk? And so Aksh is unable to answer any of those questions. But right about that point, Evil Hawk was able to basically, tap into, Chris's amulet and basically teleport, into, the ship that is now Aksh. And so Chris, I mean, he's trying to run for his life because at this point it's all he can do. And Aksh tries to fight back against Evil Hawk, but unfortunately, Evil Hawk, was, basically, gifted with, the ability to override, any sort of defense mechanisms that the ship has. And so, Aksh is unable to, further assist Chris. And once Evil Hawk, or I should say Darkhawk, gets a hold of Chris, Chris is, he's asking, him to say, look, if you're going to kill me or do this mind death thing on me, okay, answer some questions for me. I already got most of the story from Aksh, but why me? Why was I the one, who was given this ability? And, who are St. Johnny and the predecessor? And so at that point, Darkhawk decides to, at the very least, satisfy Chris Powell's curiosity. And he continues the story from where Aksh had left off. And the two androids that were still alive were basically, trying to hightail it to a part of the ship before the whole place exploded to commence this experiment with telepathy and astral projection. And so basically they attached themselves to these devices that sent their, I guess you could say their mental energy, to another place, and which this was a part of the teleportation process in which, one of the android bodies would switch places with the organic body of the owner, and this was a part of the process. But one of the people, that was in possession of this amulet, of one of the amulets, was actually an Earthman who had been working on some experiments, which had intrigued Darkenbach, and which is why he was forcibly, taken along on this scientific expedition. But, basically, he and the other scientist, they basically, sent their energies, to, Earth, where this, Earth scientist, remembered, growing up and what have you. And so in the process, though, it was like their energy, reached Earth at the speed of thought. But right when that happened, though, the android bodies were destroyed in yet another blast on the ship. And so, all their personalities and what have you, went straight to Earth. But they were attracted to the energy that was being, put out and, drawn in by, this research facility that was experimenting with extrasensory perception. And so the stuff they were doing drew the two mental patterns of these scientists, that are now just patterns of thought. And basically this merger resulted in an explosion that killed everyone at this scientific facility except for two men, who were both scientists at this facility. And they were both wounded, but they were the only survivors. And so they find themselves, basically having their personalities as well as, the scientists that were, working with Darkenbach. And so while the scientists that, were involved with Darkenbach, when they're in control of these of their newfound bodies, they try to duplicate the process of creating one of these android amulets, and they're able to do so, even with the limited technology that Earth offers. But mind you, they're tapping into a bunch of experience and knowledge that they have as scientists, and so they're able to, I guess, improvise. But unfortunately, though, when the original human hosts, are able to reassert themselves, they try and tell some of the other people on Earth, about this new threat that's coming, because they know that Darkenbach is coming for them, and will be coming for them eventually. But unfortunately, because of the fact that they're sharing bodies, they're sharing their minds and bodies, with these other people, it's like they come across as raving lunatics, so no one takes them seriously. And so, partially due to the thought patterns of the original Earth scientist, that had been abducted by Bach, he and the guy who would eventually be known as St. Johnny, they hole up at this carnival fairground where, the scientist remembered growing up. And Darkenbach, it turns out, was monitoring them from afar, with his technology and his escape vehicle. And he knew about them having created the amulet. And so, basically, he figures that whenever a member of the human race comes along and finds the amulet, and basically, is able to turn into one of these androids, that'll basically, prove that, okay, then, Bach can go ahead and come in and, use that person's body, to replace his own, since his original was destroyed. And so when Chris found that amulet, it was kind of by happenstance, really, but because he was able to successfully turn into one of these androids, Bach knew that there was a chance that he could use Chris Powell's body, to replace his own. And so it turns out that the reason that, St. Johnny, was calling him Darkhawk, calling Chris Powell Darkhawk in his new android body, was because there was a scar on the predecessor that was in the shape of a hawk. And it was like a burn mark, which is, a wound he got, when the mental energies of the original scientists basically collided and wiped out the research facility. And so once all this information is given, Chris is forced by Evil Hawk into this contraption along with Evil Hawk himself. And it's like they're on the amulet's in the center, and Chris is on one side and Evil Hawk or Darkhawk is on the other, and basically it's a battle of wills between the two of them. And Evil Hawk's just telling Powell to just give in and surrender, and the mind death will be peaceful, and you'll just be given the peace of oblivion. But Chris keeps on fighting. Like, he keeps thinking back to his family and what have you, and so it's like it goes back and forth between them. And the energy barriers that are keeping Chris in place, they loosen just enough because of this willpower factor, that Chris is able to fight through the pain, grab the amulet and yank it out of the device it's in, and it totally disrupts the mind death process. And basically he turns back into Darkhawk, and was able to get some pretty good shots in on Evil Hawk. But Evil Hawk decides that hey, if he can't have Chris's body, then neither will Chris. And so he's takes a shot at Powell's body, which is in one of these devices where the bodies switch places. And but Darkhawk, though, or Chris in Darkhawk's body, is able to use his shielding abilities to shield his human body from Darkhawk's blast. But in the process, though, the blast hits Evil Hawk and obliterates him, and much in a similar way wherein Darkhawk blew up Chris's Darkhawk body. And so once this happens, Chris is like, he's stunned. He didn't expect for himself to be the only one left standing, and especially through a stroke of luck. And so at this point, Aksh is coming back online, and he's telling Chris how proud he is of him for defeating Darkhawk. But he apologizes that he can't help him get back to his home planet. But Chris points out that Darkhawk was able to teleport from Earth, into the ship, which is now Aksh, by using Chris's Darkhawk amulet. And he's saying, surely we can duplicate the process. And Aksh points out that it's possible, but his area of expertise was in a totally different field altogether. But he can try and patch through and try and find the notes and designs that his former fellow scientists had been working on. Maybe they can come up with something. And so the two of them worked. Aksh, the ship, and Chris worked together to create this device, which will be able to use the amulet to teleport Darkhawk from Aksh back to Earth. And Chris, aka Darkhawk, is asking Aksh if there's anything he can do for him, considering his state. And so Aksh tells him, hey, I resigned myself to this a long time ago, but thank you for asking. But it's good to know that there is a Darkhawk out there that is a good person, and I'll be able to help whenever they need me. And he's obviously talking about Chris. And so Chris uses the device and teleports from Aksh back to Earth. And so while all this had been going on, there was some other stuff has been going on through all this, like stuff that's going to come up, later on in the series. But that's the main gist of, what went on in this particular storyline. Chris, he makes it back home, and he's able to, be reunited with his mother and his two brothers. But unfortunately, though, their home has been destroyed, courtesy of both St. Johnny and Evil Hawk. And so, now they have to find a new place to live. But, at least Chris is able to, go forward knowing, the true origin, of, his, Darkhawk body and, the people that got killed, creating it. But he also realizes that, St. Johnny and the predecessor, who are still on hand, they're going to have a part to play, in his story going forward. But at least he knows who they really are now. And, now that they're free of Evil Hawk, are they going to be his friends, or are they do they have some shady agenda? Who knows? But I gotta say, this was actually, a pretty good, origin story. The series, the Darkhawk series, for me, had hit a bit of a slump, starting with issue 16 and going into 19. But, from, say, like, issue 21 onward, it starts to pick up momentum again. Like the artwork, it started off as, that sort of a gritty, rough, sketchy style that Mike Manley seemed to be picking up, from issue 16, to issue 20. But, after issue 21, though, mainly because several other people were doing the inks over, Mike Manley's pencils, the artwork looked a lot more polished and sleek, much like it did, say, when the series was starting out. And I really appreciated that. So it was nice to see, the series, go back to, the gritty yet sleek art style that it had originally. And, there were a couple of, nitpicks, I guess you could say, but that has more to do with the fact that, like, there was a side plot involving the Cabal, the group of, rogue police officers that created Savage Steel, or I should say the Savage Steel armor. And there's a side plot involving them, which I feel like would have been better if they'd included it in another storyline other than this particular one, because it kind of detracts from the focus of, Chris Powell and, Darkhawk's story. Let's see, what else was there? And I was kind of hoping to see, more development, with maybe, Chris and Allegra, because to be perfectly frank, even though Allegra is, the daughter of a villain, I mean, she's a very intriguing character, and she was definitely more interesting, I thought, than Chris's, girlfriend Cheryl, and apparently a lot of the other readers did too. And so we never, at least within these particular issues, we never get to figure out if, Allegra, genuinely likes Chris. I mean, she does like him, but does she like him in a sense that, ooh, it's a new toy to play with? Or, hey, does she actually like him as a person, And maybe, they could have had some sort of, storyline where you got to see a little bit more of her backstory and what have you. I mean, because we got a good bit of it several issues back, but unfortunately, that part, that plot point, only goes so far, before it's, let for another, story or two down the road, On the other hand, let's see, I kind of like Ghost Rider's, guest appearance. I mean, some people might say it's gratuitous. I mean, considering that Ghost Rider was, a guest star in several comic books around this time. But here, at least, it kind of makes sense because, the cemetery, it's literally in Ghost Rider's stomping grounds. And so, him showing up to take on a demonic foe and help Darkhawk, it's not out of place. And so, I just think that it would have been interesting if, say, for instance, Ghost Rider hadn't split so soon after, they defeated their first foe together. Like, whoa, it would have been interesting, having Ghost Rider, helping out Darkhawk against St. Johnny. I mean, that would have been a very different fight. But at the same time, though, I guess, they used him well enough to where, I mean, he was only in one issue, but his involvement did make some sense. But, and also, in regards to, that, supernatural monster, the one with the three heads, I thought it was rather interesting that they went with that because, one, it's a horrific design, but two, though, it sort of harkens back to, the notion earlier on in the series that maybe there was a supernatural element, as in, say, like a magical element, which, some of the people, that were tampering with, the Darkhawk amulet originally, in the series, that's some of the ideas that they had. And so it sort of teases you with the notion that, maybe this is like a, something demonic in nature, which would have been an interesting twist, in regards to, Chris's power, because we're thinking it's more sci-fi, but then it'd be like, whoa, wait a minute, what's more of a horror thing, that kind of thing. But at the same time, though, it was like a nod to that idea, but I am glad that they went with the more sci-fi route in the sense of, the technology being used to switch, one's, mind from, your original body into that of a, weaponized android. And so, excuse me. So I think in regards to, Darkhawk's origin, I liked the technology, and the process that that you see on hand. I should say the technology and the processes that you see on hand in the story of what they ultimately do with them. And so that part was fascinating. But at the same time, in regards to Dargon Bach, I was kind of disappointed that they had the whole idea of Darkhawk being created as simply a byproduct of greed, as in Dargon Bach's greed. But at the same time, though, I mean, for an origin story, it was pretty cool. And I did like the idea of, a living spaceship. I mean, that was actually pretty cool. And the way it was done was nicely handled. And it was definitely a nice, touch, in the sci-fi category. So all in all, I'll go ahead and give Return to Forever, 4 stars out of 5. It was pretty good. And also, I also appreciated that it kind of, the storyline and some of the side plots, it kind of touched on, the personal, turmoil in the turmoil in Chris Powell's personal life. Like, because of his, activities as Darkhawk, his life as Chris Powell is suffering. Like, he's lost a job, he's being suspended from school and what have you. So, I mean, it kind of goes to show that, just because, you have a superpower or you have the ability to switch into a body that has powers, that doesn't mean that your life's instantly going to be better. It's like in some respects it might even be worse, So, I mean, welcome to the Marvel Universe. So I kind of like that, bit of, gritty realism that kind of comes into play in these fantastical elements. And that's one of the things that I appreciated about the Darkhawk series initially. And so it was nice to kind of see that element brought back and focused on. So, I mean, you have moments where, I mean, for crying out loud, you got Darkhawk and Ghost Rider fighting a genuinely demonic monster one minute. And then you have, people, in Chris's life, talking about, should we still, keep him on or should we fire him at the same breath, And then on the other hand, you have, I mean, a living spaceship, that is a prominent, that's a rather vital character in the story, giving Chris Powell the Darkhawk origin. And then you have, once again, people talking about Chris Powell, in his life, and saying, well, we've given him every chance he could, but he needs a kick in the butt, that kind of thing. So it's like the fantastical stuff kind of balances out with the real stuff. And so I thought it was nicely done. So, the series went on for another 25 issues, and it had 2 more annuals. So it had a pretty good run. And I've actually got the other 2 annuals, and I literally have the final 3 issues of the series. But I feel like because I haven't read the issues, from 26, onwards, I feel like it'd be unfair for me to review those issues, other issues that I do have, because I would be missing out on all the context, and so I wouldn't be able to review them as, say, like how they, lined up and with what came before, that kind of thing. But yeah, so for the purpose of this review, though, I mean, Darkhawk, Return to Forever, 4 out of 5 stars. So, yeah, that was that was it. That was Darkhawk's origin, and or at least until War of Kings. And it was a fun ride. It really was. I know it's not the final issue, but for me, it more or less is. I mean, or I should say, issue 25 kind of is for me in a way. But I will definitely be reviewing, the War of Kings storyline that Darkhawk was involved with, and also, be reviewing the Infinity War storyline that he was involved in, as well as the Sleepwalker Infinity War somewhere down the road, but hopefully soon. But real quick, I'll just go ahead and show all the cover art of these issues. So here's 21. '22. 23. That's St. Johnny. 24. An Evil Hawk. Last but not least, 25. You guys, pretty cool foil cover here. The light reflecting on it. But real quick, there's a little bonus treat here. So this is where we actually get Darkhawk's origin. So issue 25 is pretty cool. But they also have a poster. If you fold it out, give me a minute here. Ta-da! Let's see. There we go. So yeah, it's basically a recreation of the covers for issues 21 through 24, but it's a much clearer picture. So I thought that was pretty cool. Plus, it was double-sized. So I mean, the issue was double-sized. But yeah, that was Return to Forever. And much like having read the end of Sleepwalker, this point in the series of Darkhawk, it was a fun ride, and I appreciate y'all going along with me on this ride, and thanks for taking the time to check out my review. And you got any questions, comments, please drop a line below, let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all take care, good night, bye.